Let me hit the record button, and we are recording. Let me reduce this. Okay, so we're talking tonight about unconventional gardening, and just some different ways that you may attempt, especially if you don't have a perfect garden site. Perhaps some ways that you can look at growing some crops when you don't have that traditional acre or half acre, quarter acre opening with good soil. Just some things to consider. First of all, I want to make a couple of disclaimers. When we call something unconventional and we're talking about gardening, it's usually unconventional for a reason. These may not be the most efficient, so this is not something that I would recommend that you try as a commercial producer, or even if your family depends on your harvest. Your yield is probably going to be lower. There's just some different ways that you can mix things up, but probably not the most efficient way to grow, especially if you use equipment, if you're used to harvesting and growing in a certain manner. Not something that you would want to replace that conventional gardening with. And then I'll also say that a lot of these practices that we talk about, they're unconventional enough that there may or may not be a lot of research-based information out there from land-grant universities. Now, with a lot of these practices, there are elements that are researched, and you can find some good information from extension resources, but some of the things are just not something that land-grant universities will typically do a whole lot of research on and establish publications from. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So as we talk about these things, there are several topics that I came up with, things that I would consider unconventional. There are some things that I would say 15 years ago, when I first got into extension, I would considered unconventional, but at this point, they're commonplace enough that I don't put them in that category anymore. But one of them, and this is just a conglomeration of several practices that you may see, it's what I would call crowded gardens, and I'll expand on that a little bit shortly. We're going to talk some about no-dig gardening. Could also be called no-till, deep mulch gardening. That's something that might be worth a look if you have poor soil, especially. Hugelkultur is one that I'm hearing more and more about, but it's still fairly new. Not a lot of people will use it. It's globally, it's a practice that's been around for a very long time. But as far as American gardeners using this practice, it's something that's you don't see a whole lot of. Hydroponics we'll talk about, especially one type of hydroponics that I think is very conducive to growing in the backyard. We'll talk about food forests, and we'll talk about wick beds, and we'll kind of move through those. First of all, I want everybody to just take a look at this picture here and just think about it for a second. And I have a poll. I do want to ask your opinion on this. So just take a look at this, and the question is, and you can move the poll out of the way so you can see the picture better. But when you look at this picture, do you find this garden visually appealing? Just answer yes or no. Okay, we have about 8 people who've responded. We'll give you another 30 seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll, and I'm going to share the results. And 56% said no, they didn't think this garden was visually appealing. 44% said yes. And if we wanted to really be scientific with it, we could break down who said what. And who liked it, who didn't like it, I think that would reveal a lot of things about generational preferences. But I sent this to my sister today, and I said, show this to my dad and see what he thinks. And I didn't get a response back, but I personally think that my dad, as well as my grandparents, would have been pretty offended by this garden. This is not something that we would have had growing up, not something that would have been tolerated, especially if the neighbors could see it. But it seems like the older I get, the more I appreciate this kind of garden. It doesn't have the nice straight solid rows. It doesn't have a lot of bare space. I remember when we were growing up, we had a notch on our hoe so that we knew how far apart to put the rows. We would know that notch indicated how wide our tiller was so that we could go in and clean out in the bulk. But this is something that I think generationally, or just depending on what culture you're from, whether you're from a rural area or an urban area, a lot of people just don't find this type of garden attractive. And that's not a correct or an incorrect answer. It's just, I've noticed as I get older, the more I appreciate this kind of garden. I just find this a little more visually appealing than I would have 20, 30 years ago. And incidentally, this picture came out of an extension resource talking about no-till gardens. So I want to ask the same question, but the same kind of look here. You might find this one a little more appealing than the previous picture, just because there's more color, there's more bloom, but same kind of situation here. You have a lot of things jammed together. You don't have a lot of exposed soil. This is something that wouldn't have flown in my family when I was growing up. And I know I have a few neighbors who would probably come talk to me if they saw a garden like this on my property. But it's all in the eye of the beholder. And one of the things that I do like about this, as well as the previous one, is there's a lot of use of space. You're cramming a lot of things into a very small space. Now, is this going to produce as much yield as a conventional clean garden? Probably not, because you're going to have competition from a lot of different things. But if your family doesn't depend on it, if your livelihood doesn't depend on it, this could be a creative expression for you to use in a small garden space, just to get those different things crammed into a tighter space. As well as with this. This is, I can't remember where this photo came from, but it's one I've used with an intercropping presentation that I've done for several years. A lot of things put really close together. And this is one, this technique is called wide row planning. And I think of this, I know Woody here is on Instagram. He posts pictures of his garden, very beautiful gardens there over in Harlan County where Jeremy's at, that he plants. I would consider his a wide row growing system like this. He uses raised beds without the frames. Very attractive way to grow, I think. So this is a way to make use of that space, but there are definitely some drawbacks. There are equipment limitations, perhaps. If there's a disease issue that gets in a particular plant, it's going to move through the entire crop very quickly. So there are negatives to this, but it's also can be something that really makes use of your space and gets a whole lot in a relatively small area. So this is something that I've come to appreciate. And then another technique just to get that crowded garden effect and to make use of that space. I think this is rare enough, I think, that I would consider it unconventional, but the whole concept of secession planning, so that in the summer, when you harvest one crop, you're ready to put something right back in that space. So you take advantage of that, those multiple growing seasons. So again, this falls into what I would consider crowded gardening, and it's just a matter of taste. A lot of people like this visually, a lot of people don't, but it's something to consider. And if it is something that you would like to consider, there's a publication that Colorado Extension does, and it's just called Block style layout and raised bed vegetable gardens. You can Google that. And it talks about the spacing. Rather than growing in rows, it talks about how to grow in blocks or wide rows and how far apart you need to plant. For example, with beets, 4 to 6 inches by 4 to 6 inch grid will take care of your beets. A lot of your other crops that you might grow in that type of scenario, from garlic to lettuce, onions, parsnips, all of those can be grown in a block style planting rather than in a row, traditional row type of situation. And even some crops that you may not think of in terms of being able to put into a block, things like cabbages, broccoli, you can space those out 18 inches by 18 inches in a grid. Corn, you really should be planting corn in a block anyway because it's wind pollinated. So whenever I see a single row of corn, it makes me cringe a bit, because when the wind blows and that pollen moves, it just is going to land on the ground instead of another corn plant. So corn is always going to be better if you plant it in a block type scenario. Peppers, potatoes. I do have some red Pontiac potatoes planted right now in a block style bed, and they're spaced out about 12 inches by 12 inches in a grid pattern. And I would have gotten pictures, but right now there's nothing emerged from the soil. I planted them not that long ago. So once everything's nice and green and that starts filling in, that might make a more visually appealing picture. But just a planting style that you may consider. And here's the link to that particular publication from Colorado Extension. So that's one to take a look at. Put in your references if this type of planting does appeal to you. We'll talk some about no-till gardening, also called deep mulch or no-dig, or at the very least, you might consider a minimal till garden. When we're talking about the soil, there are 3 categories of soil health, things that contribute to the health of your soil. Number 1 is the physical properties and the structure of that soil, how it's layered. Here you can see you've got a organic layer, and then you get into the clay and the parent material down below. And that develops in such a way that if it's healthy soil and a good structure, that you're going to have good drainage. This is going to be a good healthy soil. And think about it, every time you till, you disrupt that. You move some of that parent material to the top. You take some of that organic matter and make it deeper. And I'm not arguing against tillage. There's certainly some advantages with breaking up the compaction and providing some aeration to the soil and getting rid of some of those weeds. But there's also a good argument to be made for no-till if you can pull that off. Biological properties, if you think about that soil, it's not just a growing medium. There are a lot of living things in the soil, fungi, bacteria, earthworms. Those things are in the soil, and every time you till, you are going to disrupt that environment, especially with fungi. There are more and more studies coming out looking at how fungi and the mycorrhizal relationships connect plants over a very large area. And so every time you run a rototiller through there, you're going to disrupt that relationship. So that's something to consider. And if you can pull off the no-till gardening, then you're going to have some advantage by protecting those relationships. Another thing about the soil out in your garden is it's a weed bank. You've got seeds, weed seeds in that soil, and a lot of weed seeds will stay dormant for 40 years or more. And the reason those haven't germinated is they're just deep enough that they don't get the warmth, they don't get the sunlight, they don't get the moisture levels they need to really germinate at the right time. So they just lay dormant. And like I said, sometimes for decades, those seeds will lay there. Cuckleburr is one I remember that will just lay there in the soil, deep in the soil for years. And then every year when you run that rototiller through, you're going to bring a lot of those seeds up closer to the surface. And so they're going to germinate. And you may wonder, where do all these weeds come from? And that's just because you're bringing up that weed bank. You're mixing that up every year and you're bringing those to the surface. And so one argument for no-till is that the weed pressure will steadily go down because you're not bringing that seed bank up to the surface. So over time, if you do no-till for years and years, your weed pressure is going to get less and less. So some tips and techniques if you're considering no-till or minimal till. One tool that I would highly recommend that you have in your arsenal is a broad fork, like you see here. When you run a rototiller through your garden, you're going to loosen up those top several inches of soil, but then that equipment is going to make a hard pan down beneath that. It's going to compact that soil in. So you're going to have nice loose soil on the top, and then you're going to have a compacted layer below that. A broad fork is a good tool that will help break that up. Now, these are expensive tools, but they are worth having if you're going to do no-till, because they can help break up that hard pan. And for the reasons I just mentioned, a broad fork is also good to have if you use a rototiller, because you can follow up your tilling and you can break up that that compacted soil that's down below your growing area. Another recommendation is if you're using a no-till technique and you get to the end of the season, you don't want to pull your plants up, because again, that will disrupt that soil structure. What you want to do is cut all your plants off at the soil line and dispose of them, and then let those roots decompose over the winter months. And that's going to contribute a lot to the overall health of your soil. It's a good idea to keep the soil covered. Always keep a cover crop on there. And I recommend to our Grow Wise folks to, in the fall, when you get done planting, you can sow a cover crop or a green manure crop of something like hairy vetch and rye and crimson clover. And even in the summer months, when you've got bare ground in June or July, buckwheat is a good one to sow. And you're going to get some benefit of adding that organic matter, but also keeping that soil nice and covered. And those crops will grow thick enough that they can shade out some of the weeds, and they can act as a living mulch. If you're a commercial producer, I know the University of Tennessee at their field day, they have an organic field day down in Knoxville every year. And one of the things they do, they'll grow hairy vetch, and they'll go in the spring, and they've got an implement they pull behind the tractor that knocks down and crushes that hairy vetch. It just knocks it down and kills it, and then it's left there as a mulch. And then they come back and they put their transplants or they seed into that material that they've just killed and crushed. One challenge of no-till gardening is finding enough mulch and compost to keep things going. And Shad, Jeremy, and I had this discussion not long ago. We were talking about, we've all tried the no-till thing, and it's worked in varying degrees. But I know for me, one of the things that I struggle with is finding enough material to keep piling that mulch on and keep that ground covered so we don't get a lot of weed pressure. It's good if you've got access to maybe some rotted hay bales, or you've got access to wood chips or something that you could add a whole lot of material at once. But if you've ever started a compost pile, you're going to notice how quickly that material will melt down, and it'll be gone, and it won't be of any use to you. So it's good if you have access to a whole lot of material. You can try the no-till. If not, then try to size your beds with what is available to you. So this might be all the no-till you do in any season. This is a technique called sheet mulching. It's also called lasagna gardening. And it just involves making your bed, putting down a whole lot of cardboard or thick, damp newspaper, and that's going to smother out the weeds. And then you're going to layer, just like with lasagna, you're going to layer things on top of it. You might put a layer of compost, a layer of chopped leaves, a layer of manure, and you just keep adding those layers on. And at the end of that, you're going to have a medium that you can plant directly into. You don't have to do any tillage here. you've created your topsoil, basically, is what you've done. And a couple of resources that I wanted to point you to. One is the University of New Hampshire Extension. They have a nice little write-up on no-till and minimal till gardening, and that's the URL for that. And another fellow that I've come to respect a lot, his name is Charles Dowding. He's an English gardener. He has several books on no-dig gardening, as well as a very nice YouTube channel that where he goes over the process. And he is a market gardener, so he uses these techniques, and then he does sell a lot of his produce. And very, very soft-spoken English gentleman. I think you'll enjoy his YouTube channel, but he certainly knows what he's talking about, and he's got the images to prove it. One thing Dowding does, though, he uses a copious volume of compost. He has very large compost bins. He has a lot of manure and wood chips delivered, and he's constantly creating this compost that he uses on his gardens. So those are a couple of resources if the whole concept of no-till does pique your interest. Okay, Hugelkultur, this is one that especially needs a little bit of disclaimer. It's not something that is used a lot, and it's not something that you can find a whole lot of research-based information on, but it is an old technique. And essentially how Hugelkultur works is it's a German word. First of all, it means hill culture. So you create a hill and you grow your plants on that hill. And essentially how it works is you'll make a depression where you're going to make this bed, and you'll put dead wood. You'll just layer dead wood in there, pretty sizable logs, cut those up, layer them in, and then put smaller and smaller materials on top. And then you might put a layer of leaf litter or a layer of straw, and then you put the soil back on. And what you end up with is a ridge, a very tall ridge, maybe up to 3 feet tall. And the claim behind this is that rotting wood will act as a sponge, and during dry times, the roots of your plants will be able to reach into those decaying logs and make use of the moisture. Washington State University, Montana State University, University of Minnesota, and UC Berkeley, they have initiated studies on Hugelkultur, but as of yet, there's not a lot of published information. I'll show you a publication that Washington State, just an initial one, about 5 pages that they put out on Hugelkultur, what it is. It's called Hugelkultur, what is it, and should it be used in home gardens? And I'll just tell you, spoiler alert here, they don't speak very highly of it. They say it can't really hurt, but they're not huge fans of Hugelkultur. And they take issue with some of the claims that are being made. There are some claims that when you use Hugelkultur beds, that supplemental watering and fertilizing are unnecessary because the decaying wood will provide the moisture as well as some fertility. Those claims are unsubstantiated and not very likely. So don't think that you're going to use a Hugelkultur bed and not have to water ever and not have to fertilize ever. There are some advantages, and I've used Hugelkultur, and I plan to use some more Hugelkultur this year, but it's not going to be a miracle gardening technique. Another issue is going to be weeding, because you look at these pictures here and you imagine all the weeds that may spring up on that soil. Well, you can't, it's not going to be as easy to hoe as a conventional bed. So you're going to have to do some hands and knees type weeding to get a lot of those weeds removed. So this is that same publication I just showed you from Washington State. Again, they're not huge fans of Hugelkultur. That's not research based yet. They've started that process, but these are just their initial impressions of the concept of Hugelkultur. And I snapped a picture of this afternoon. This is in the edge of my garden. I had a neighbor who gave me some Egyptian walking onions, and I put them in my conventional garden, and they didn't do great. But when they were ready to reproduce, I took the small onions and I created this. This is sort of a modified Hugelkultur bed. I removed about 6 inches of soil out of this bed. I put in one layer of rotten wood, and then I put the soil back over the top of it. So I didn't mound it up. It's more at conventional ground level, but there is rotted wood underneath. And this has done pretty well for me. I've been pretty happy with the production here. We'll move into hydroponics and talk about that one method in particular that I wanted to discuss with you. And this picture here, this was Saturday. Some of our new master gardeners took a tour to Department of Corrections Camp 18 down in Coburn. And this is one of their hydroponic greenhouses. This is what's called the nutrient film technique, or NFT. This is probably one of the most common types of hydroponics. And the way it works is you see this long row here with these tomatoes. There's a trough underneath here, and the far end is a little bit lower than the upper end. So a very nutrient rich liquid is run constantly through these troughs. It doesn't stop. There's no still water at all, just a constant flow. And it's very rich in nutrients, and those nutrients, they bond to the plant roots, and you can see how well those are growing. Now, their trenches used to be open, and because of all the sunlight, they were getting a lot of algae and having some problems because of that. But they have those covered now, and so that water and those roots are a whole lot cleaner with no algae issues. But this works really well. And those large tomatoes, you can't tell from the picture, but they're in a net pot about this size. And then the roots come out, and they're in contact with that nutrient flow that's coming through. Float systems are another type of hydroponics. If you've ever grown tobacco transplants, that possibly is how you did it. You've got a tank or a pool, and you have styrofoam rafts, and you have your tobacco plants, or in some cases I've seen corn or tomatoes grown in those float systems. They're sitting in the raft, and they just reach out into the nutrient solution. There's also an aeration method, and this is one that I consider more of a Mars, a NASA type method. That's where the roots are exposed, and there's a mist system that is just constantly spraying water onto those exposed roots. And I've seen demonstrations. I think it might have been from one of the Disneys somewhere. They had a Home of the Future exhibit, and they had a round growing system, and they had plants on the outside, and those roots were exposed in the center. And there was a sprayer inside. As these plants rotated, they were sprayed constantly with that nutrient-rich solution. There's bag culture, just where your tomato plant or another plant is grown in a bag. There's no soil. It's just some kind of material to hold the roots in place. And then an emitter, a little tube runs into that bag and just constantly carries the nutrients to those roots. But the one that I want to talk to you about, and this is one that I think you could experiment with this year, it's called the Kratky method. And the Kratky method is a type of hydroponics that was developed by Dr. B.A. Kratky from the University of Hawaii. And this is how a Kratky system works. It's non-circulating, so you don't have to come up with a series of pumps, and you don't have to keep the water moving. You just fill up a reservoir with your nutrient solution, and you have your plant in a net pot dangling over that, and those roots grow into the solution. And there's an air gap between the solution and the top of your pot. And what happens as that plant uses those nutrients, that level will drop, but the roots will get deeper and deeper. And so there's no need to bring in more solution and keep that going. Now, this works good with leafy vegetables, and I'll show you some pictures in a second. If you're doing something like peppers or tomatoes, you can also use the Kratky method for those, but you do have to top that solution off because the plant's not finished producing by the time this nutrient solution gets used up. So it's non-circulating, so you don't have to use pumps and that type of thing. You can grow this in buckets or totes. And the first time I ever saw this method or heard of this method, there was a fellow about my age and his dad. They had a lean-to hothouse on the back of their garage. They were using this. They were growing a lot of cabbages and lettuces and tomatoes and peppers in totes and buckets, just in their little hothouse. So leafy vegetables, as I mentioned, head lettuces, kale, those would just require one fill up. So you fill up that bucket and you put your plant in the net pot. And by the time the nutrient is used up, your plant is ready to harvest. Again, with tomatoes or peppers, you may have to top those off. And you can find a lot of videos on YouTube of people using this method for tomatoes, and they'll rig up different systems with valves and they will use pumps, but that's not 100% necessary. This was a little experiment I did. I think this was back in 2017. I bought some broccoli plants and celery plants and lettuce plants, and I had some buckets, 5-gallon buckets, and used a circle saw. I bought the net pots off eBay. I don't remember how much they were, but they were dirt cheap. I got a whole lot of net pots for not a whole lot of money. And I got these clay pebbles. They're just used to put in the net pot and hold the plant upright. And then I also bought some fertilizer to put in the bucket, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So this is the first day I started this. This was broccoli, and I could have put 4 plants in this particular bucket lid, but I just went with 2. And this is near the end of the season. The picture on the right is celery. I've never grown celery before, and you can see how healthy and strong the roots were. And we did harvest and use celery in 2017. This is not even the end of the growing season. These roots were a lot bigger and stronger looking by the time it was time to harvest. So you can see here's the broccoli. Here's a head lettuce that I used. This was here was the celery, then another head lettuce and another celery. I will tell you that the broccoli was it developed some of the prettiest leaves that I've ever seen. Very big, luscious plants, but it never developed a head. So in the future, if I ever do this again, I'm not gonna use broccoli. Use something that I would harvest the leaves from, something like kale or lettuce, or even the celery did really well. So one of the challenges with hydroponics is thinking about the number of elements plants need to thrive. When we're growing in a conventional garden, we're really manipulating 3 elements for the most part: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those 3 numbers on a bag of fertilizer. But plants actually need 17 different elements to thrive. And when you're growing in a conventional bed, a lot of those nutrients are already in your soil. They're in the organic matter, they're in the soil itself. And so you don't have to think about those because they're there. But if you're not using soil, then you have to provide that in some way. So this is just something that I was taught when I was at the University of Tennessee. C. Hopkins Cafe Mighty Good, managed by cousin Como Clark. That's just the 17 elements that plants need to thrive. If you break that down by each symbol, that's a way that you can remember each and every one of those. And again, if you're doing this hydroponically, you've got to think about providing each and every one of those. So you'll find a lot of resources online. People have tried to come up with their own formulas, and it'll be sometimes pretty complicated. To say 2 cups of wood ashes, um, you know, a half teaspoon of rabbit manure, and a half cup of chicken manure, and eye of a newt, and shredded leaves, and all this stuff. But what I did is I just ordered a solution that had everything in it. And this was the most expensive purchase I made when I tried that hydroponic system. But the thing is, it takes about 2 tablespoons per 5 gallons of water. So it goes a long way. So even though it's expensive, it was a lot better than trying to guess at how I'm going to meet all those nutritional needs. So another thing I'll talk about here, this concept of permaculture, or especially a food forest. And we do have a person who's logged in who started the process of a food forest. The concept of permaculture it's an Australian philosophy. Bill Mollison is the one who penned the term. He was a writer who developed the whole concept of permanent agriculture, something that you could put in place and something that would continue to produce food over the years. You're trying to mimic a natural system, a natural ecosystem. And if you think about the forests that we have around here, we're going to have these dominant trees, we're going to have intermediate trees, we're going to have a shrub layer, we're going to have vines running through the forest, we're going to have ground covers. And essentially that's what you're doing with a food forest, a permaculture food forest. You're just trying to mimic that type of growth pattern and those growth layers. So you might start with something like your canopy. Your large tree could be some kind of fruit producer. It could be a walnut tree or pecan tree. And then you're going to have some dwarf fruit trees underneath. That's going to be your intermediate tree layer. Your shrubs could be things like currants or gooseberries. You're going to have your herbaceous layer. That could be some of those medicinal herbs that people are growing now. You're going to have surface ground covers, things like strawberries, rhubarb, those types of things that might grow beneath these canopy layers. And then you could use vines, you could use grapes, you could use passion flower and things like that. But again, essentially, you're just trying to mimic that natural environment and that natural ecosystem with these different layers of food producing crops that are going to take place for years and going to be active for years. This was a project done by, I think this was at Western Michigan University. It's called the Gibbs House Food Forest. So I think this might be a sorority or a fraternity that did this, but they had a pretty elaborate plan of different crop trees as well as crop shrubs. And then this is a concept that is recognized by the USDA Forest Service. And this was an article I found from 2018 where they took an urban forest near Atlanta, and they're in the process of converting that into a food forest, based on the idea that this could be sources of food that people could make use of. And then this is another, also from the USDA Forest Service website. This is just a demonstration food forest. I'm not even sure where this is, but you can see the different layers in there. These are all food producing herbs, or they're at least something that's going to complement the food producers. So you get that large tree. I can't tell if that's a nut tree, but it's probably what we're looking at. And then you've got things like Jerusalem artichokes, you've got strawberries, you've got some herbs mixed in there. But again, just mimicking those layers that you'd find in a natural forest. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about are wick beds. And Shad actually sent me this publication. It's a newer publication from the University of Kentucky. And Jeremy and Shad, if you all want to weigh in on this, feel free to. I don't know a whole lot about these, but essentially what you look at with raised beds is there's a lot of value in those, but they can get dry very quick. So if we have a drier year, you're going to have to constantly water those beds, or you're going to lose your crops. So the wicking bed's just a way for a raised bed to be pretty much self-watering. And what that would involve, the steps here, you would just build your bed like you normally would, and you'd line it with a pond liner. You'd put in 6-inch perforated drain pipe, and you'd have a overflow pipe here, and you've got this optional corrugated pipe where you can put, that'd be where you drop earthworms or you drop compost into the system. And these pipes are going to be full of water. And on top of that, you're going to put on equal layers of peat moss, compost, and then your potting media on top of that. And a disadvantage of any raised bed, but especially this type of system, there's a lot of input involved. It is pretty costly. And so this is a materials list. This is based on 2020 prices. So it's not that long ago, but the materials needed for one 3-foot by 10-foot wicking bed come to about $420. And that's not even looking at your planting media. So it's expensive. But if you you like the idea of a raised bed, but you want one that you can sort of walk away from and not have to worry so much about the watering issue, then that might be something that's worth the investment. But I do have the link here. I'm guessing maybe Shad or Jeremy might have put it in the chat box too. At the bottom of this is where you'd find that publication, and it will tell you all about the wicking beds and how to make use of those. But I'm gonna stop sharing now, and let's see what's in the chat. Looks like Jeremy. Thanks, Jeremy. You put in the links to some of these publications. Shad has as well. So rather than writing those down, y'all can just click on those to find the publications I mentioned. All right. So are there any questions?
Jeremy and I have decided that we are grossly underachieving. You did a phenomenal job on this one.
Great
Well,
stuff.
it's kind of fast, and we just kind of dabbled on a lot of different things, but this was one of those fun ones. I get to decide what I consider an unconventional garden. It's not something that's written in stone. So.
When you opened with the little picture of the probe on Mars, I knew that we were going to see great things. So I did have a comment that you'll probably get to see later, but on that Hugelkultur or whatever it was called, if you took hay bales and kind of filled between that with the wood and the mulch and compost and all those things, would that make it easier to work? One of the complaints was the ability to work that mound. But if you kind of squared it off so that it was kind of a cross between a raised bed and this other thing, would that offset one of the?
Yes, absolutely. And I didn't include any pictures, but a lot of people, there's an Australian gardener, trying to think of the YouTube channel, but he uses a lot of the Hugelkultur methods, but he uses raised beds, and the same thing would work for the straw bale beds, but he will just layer that wood in a raised bed and put his soil material on top. And of course that does sink over time. It's not going to be a permanent mound. So you're gonna have to build it back up again, but yeah, what you're talking about with the hay bales would work just fine. Aaron had asked, how would you add fertilizer to a no-till garden? You would just layer it in, because once things are growing, you just continue to add those layers. And Jeremy and Shad, I know they've used that. What I used the method on was potatoes one year. I had my potatoes, and every time they would grow up a few inches, then I would pile on the mulch and pile on manure, layer manure, and pile on straw. And they would just keep emerging and keep climbing and coming out of there. And it worked well, but the growth outran my supply of mulching material, so it didn't work as well as I would have liked.
We've talked about this mulch issue before, and if you've got a lawnmower with a bagger on it, you always have to do something with those grass clippings. And in the fall, if you run it over leaves in your yard or something, that's a great way to get the extra mulch that he's talking about.
Yeah, that would be. One big proponent decades ago for this no-till method was Ruth Stout of Rodale Press, which owned Mother Earth News. She was a big proponent of no-till gardening, but it sounds like she had neighbors that would just constantly bring her shredded wood and rotted hay, and just she had a constant supply coming in, and that's what you'd need if you did that on a large scale.
I get a lot of my mulch from the wood that I split. If you burn firewood, when you use the splitter, you have a lot of that bark and little pieces of wood that come off of it, and you have to do something with it. And I just add it to my garden. So.
Yep. And that's a good point. A lot of people are afraid of fresh wood chips. And they can cause a problem if you incorporate those into the soil, because as they decay, they're going to use up a lot of nitrogen. And you'll notice if you bury fresh sawdust or wood chips around your plants, you'll notice those plants get yellow almost immediately. But putting them on as a mulch on the top layer, you're going to be fine, because they're not going to suck the nitrogen out of the soil. All right.
Lots of compliments there, Phil. And when you get a chance to read all the dings that were coming through on your phone,
well,
you'll get more suggestions and commentary and some pithy comments as well. So,
well, I heard those dings and I knew they were coming from you all. I just kept thinking, what am I going to be reading when I get done?
You did a phenomenal job. This is probably one of the better ones we've had.
Well, I appreciate that.
Great job. Some of those cell phone dings were actually deliberate once we figured out we could do it and pester you.
That was all Jeremy.
that works.
Great stuff, Phil. Awesome stuff. Wonderful.
On that food forest, I did have one last question, and that is, if you said it, I didn't catch it. How do they know which type of plants to use in that system? Is there enough literature on it that you would know that this is a good tree, this is a good shrub? You have to have plants that will tolerate shade, and you have to make sure that you've got, trees that aren't going to have surface roots that are going to compete too much with your shrubs and your other things. So.
And I think a lot of it is just trial and error at this point, to be honest. We know certain things like currants and gooseberries do okay in partial shade, so they would be fine beneath the canopy of a larger tree. And I kind of think of food forest, we can all name garden plants that have thrived without people, or maybe especially because people weren't there. I know on hikes, we've run across orchards that were bearing apples, not pretty apples, not perfect apples, but they were producing. And you think about the walnuts that you run across in the middle of nowhere, and we could all probably point to an old homestead that has rhubarb and asparagus and things like that growing without any management from humans whatsoever. So I kind of think of food forest as bringing all those things together as best you can, all those things that can do okay without us, and trying to get them into the same created ecosystem, I guess, just trying to get those all together. But yeah, to answer your question about what the perfect tree is or the perfect shrub is, and that, I think it's just a lot of a lot of trial and error at this point, and just based on what your experiences are and what you've seen.
So you didn't find any literature when you were researching this?
Nothing research based. There's a whole lot of if you put in permaculture, you can find a whole lot of popular press type stuff that's out there, and a lot of people doing things that probably work okay. But if you're looking for USDA or extension literature, there's not a whole lot.
Excellent job, Phil.
Thank
Great
And-
stuff. Thank you.
you. And what's coming up Thursday?